everybody. It's good to see you guys join me again. I'm sure you remember my three guests from my last YouTube discussion about the Harvey Weinstein phenomenon and the problem of sexual assault and harassment. Once again, in the top left corner, we have my friend Anna Shane Fan. Bottom left, Charles Boyd. Bottom right, Kat Murdy. Thanks so much to you guys for joining me again. One thing that actually happened after our last discussion is that the four of us actually continued talking for like another maybe half hour after we stopped recording. And so we all decided that we really needed to follow up on this discussion again. So here we are. One place where we left off was in sharing personal experiences with either sexual assault or knowing people who've been through sexual assaults and the different ways that some of them chose to deal with it. I have several friends and acquaintances of mine who are survivors of full-fledged rape, and I can tell you the first of them to share her experience with me told me that she didn't even bother to report it to the authorities because she didn't want to have to go to trial and have to sit in the witness box and have a glib, slick defense lawyer drag her name through the mud. Another was a friend of mine in college who I think was actually assaulted by her older sister's fiance, believe it or not. And I think she reported him, and the university he was attending at the time took action, but the legal authorities did not. Still another was one who was assaulted a couple of years ago and who reported everything to the authorities and was eventually told that there wasn't anything they could do because the evidence wasn't strong enough. And so her assailant still walks free. So that's just a very quick taste of the kinds of experiences that women go through, both when they don't report what's done to them and when they do. So those of you out there who are thinking that you can just brush off what a lot of, say, Harvey Weinstein's accusers have been testifying to by saying, why didn't you go to the police if it was really so serious? Y'all really don't know what you're talking about. And I don't know if you wanted to build on that, add your own experiences, your own insights to that. Feel free.
Sure. I actually wanted to touch on a couple of points that you had made regarding evidence and the way women are treated in these sort of circumstances. It is on the victim to prove that they are in fact a victim in our justice system. And we have an issue where we have years of rape kits that have not been processed in many cities. Detroit and Atlanta have recently been called on the carpet about that, where these things have just literally been locked in storage. If you do report it, which is extraordinarily hard to do, by the time they finally get around to doing anything about it, a lot of times it's not even admissible anymore. It's weak evidence. You have a lot of instances in which, because you haven't said enough or because you don't know enough about what has happened to you, that you get dismissed altogether. I think that's kind of a symptom of a larger problem. There is a lot of victim blaming. Well, what were you wearing is a common question. Like, what did you do to make this happen to you? Maybe sometimes there are like miscommunicated expectations about where things are going, but I would say most of the time that's not the case at all. And I think that's a conversation that we need to be having. As far as my own personal experiences with aggression against me in a sexual manner, I mean, it started when I was really young. The story that I was telling you guys about was when I was 16 and I had my first real job at Burger King, and a guy asked me for barbecue sauce, and when I reached over to get it for him, he grabbed a handful of my boob and I went up the side of his head with the tray. And the lady that was standing beside him in line actually started whipping him with her purse, which was absolutely full to the brim of all kinds of stuff. So I know it had to hurt. But of course, when that happened, like my manager ran out and was like, what's going on? And I turned around on him and he was like, he wanted to have this really strange conversation with me about assaulting customers. And I was like, no. I will take you all to jail. I was like, I'm 16 years old. He grabbed my breast. And if you do anything to me, it's going to be a bad day. I'm taking all of you to court. I did make a big deal about it. And every time something did happen to me, for the most part, I did make a big deal about it. I never just let it go. And the reason I never could do it was because, not really just for me, because I mean, I was hopping mad, and I was like, you are not going to get away with this. But it was also because if they can do it to me and then get away with it, they might do it to somebody else. They're probably going to do it to somebody else. A lot of times I was scared to death because I never knew really what the outcome was going to be. And there was a really strong chance that I was going to be publicly shamed for something that was not my fault at all. When you were talking about that, I'm like, that's exactly what happens. But I felt that I couldn't not do something And I had the backup, I had the support system in place to do something about it. My mother was always 100% behind me. We had a conversation that I think a lot of mothers and daughters are not having, or weren't at the time. Let me put it that way. It was not just a conversation about be modest and protect yourself and what have you. It was also like, you fight like hell, and I will back you up all day, every step of the way. A lot of girls aren't given the second part of that conversation, and they're afraid of the consequences of telling their parents or their friends and what they'll think. So I think that changing the conversation, which is what's happening now with the Harvey Weinstein debacle, we're changing the national conversation about how these things are taken care of. It's just that it's happening in an industry that has been, that's what they've been doing for decades. And now they're starting to really call that on the carpet. Mayim Bialik, I'm not really sure how to say her last name.
Bialik.
And her op-ed, which is something that you wanted to discuss, did a really good job of illustrating how fearful a lot of those women are in that industry, and how many people don't talk about it. So with that, I take it to somebody else because I can go for days.
Right, of course. Oh yeah. I mean, not only could you write a book about your experiences, a number of women have written books about their experiences in this area. I'm glad you brought up the Mayim Bialik article, as well as your experiences with how your mother tried to prepare you for having to deal with this sort of problem, because that's actually the main topic I wanted to tackle in this conversation. What approach, if any, should parents and others take when it comes to trying, to the extent they can, to protect young girls and women from this scourge? And you know, that's itself a major bone of contention. I think that there are right ways to go about it and very wrong ways to go about it, and more often than not, people go about it in the wrong ways, and you guys have already illustrated some of the wrong ways. In her article in the New York Times, before she eventually apologized, Mayim Bialik did illustrate some of the wrong ways to go about it, talking about how she dresses modestly and refrains from flirting with men.
He actually said, I refrain from flirting with men as a policy.
Right, exactly. And the problem with that is that it does tacitly send the message, or at least risk sending the message, that because I did those things, I was never sexually assaulted, which is not really an accurate statement. I mean, women of all inclinations, whether you want to call them modest or immodest, which is obviously very loaded language to begin with, women with all different kinds of lifestyles, different sexual habits, etc., different styles of dress, end up being sexually assaulted anyway. So I don't know that you can establish any kind of correlation between what a woman wears, whether she behaves modestly or not, whether she's flirtatious or not, and being sexually assaulted. With that said, I do think that there are one or two forms of advice that women in that position should be given. Namely, like you said, stand up for yourself. Don't blame yourself for what's happening, because it'll never be your fault. Fight back to the extent that you can. That is a judgment call that has to be made. Fighting back can take different forms, physical or otherwise, legal, and some of those tactics will work in some situations, and in other cases they may backfire.
Right.
But, there is one piece of advice that I've heard people give, which is, especially on college campuses, if you're at a party or so on, be sure to curb your alcohol consumption. And I've heard some people react very badly to that advice, because to them it comes across as victim blaming. And I think that's going too far in the opposite direction. The research I've seen indicates, especially on college campuses, a lot of sexual assaults are perpetrated against victims who are incapacitated, intoxicated by some substance, whether it's alcohol or drugs. And I think it stands to reason that someone who's incapacitated is a more attractive target for all kinds of crime, not even just sexual assault. Right. And that's happened to me and acquaintances of mine in the past as well, not necessarily sexual assault, but other forms of assault. There needs to be room to say we need to tackle the societal problem of rape culture and everything that that entails. And we need to teach men and boys not to rape, not to commit sexual assault. But like Mayim Bialik said in her article, and I think she was onto something here, it's going to take time for that cultural shift to occur. And in the meantime, there are predators out there who are going to be attacking women. I don't think that someone who is making a good faith effort to try to give advice to girls and women about how they can minimize or reduce their vulnerability to sexual assault should be dragged for it. If the advice is factually unsound, they should definitely be corrected. And people should definitely point out, well, actually, the evidence indicates that's not good advice. It's actually not helpful. We should definitely set people like Mayim Bialik straight on that front. But I think there's a difference between correcting those misconceptions and condemning those folks or assassinating their character. And a lot of the response to Mayim Bialik's article drifted into that latter category, and I think that that was unfair. That's just my take on it. Kat, I think you actually mentioned Mayim Bialik's article. I think you were the first one to bring it up in our last conversation. So I'd like to give you the floor next.
Actually, I'm really glad you brought that up. And I'm glad that you framed it in this way, because I don't think Mayim Bialik actually went out and decided, hey, you know what? Like, if you got raped, it's your fault. But I completely understand why people responded the way that they did, with her saying things like, oh, I never had this problem because I chose not to wear makeup and not to do my nails. And there was certainly this weirdly bitter animosity in her piece that I can see people really responded to. I want to go back to what you're saying about factual inaccuracy. Women wearing burqas get raped. FLDS women with their long covering modest dresses straight to the floor to their wrists get raped. We've seen these cases come out over and over again. Women within the Quiverful movement, which is that evangelical movement, the Dugars are probably the most famous members of that movement. They get raped. It's certainly not the case that acting or dressing more modest will make you not be raped. And as for alcohol, yes, obviously if you are completely incapacitated, you can be more of a target for people who want to hurt you for whatever way. I also want to push back the idea that just because we see more assaults happening to people who have consumed alcohol on college campuses necessarily means that the alcohol was the cause. Let's be honest, people consume a lot of alcohol on college campuses. If we were just randomly spot checking people for whether or not they consumed alcohol, probably be at least a whole lot of those people that you're stopping and checking. So I don't think that those are very powerful arguments, to be honest. And I think that there is a lot of victim blaming that comes from that. I don't think it's from people who actually mean to be victim blaming. They're saying, how can I prevent this? And of course, you know, you want to be safe. You can try to do these measures, but this is never going to be a full protection. And I think that we see a lot of similar issues coming from, for instance, from Second Amendment supporters. And, you know, I'm a big gun rights person. I think that guns should be totally legal. I'm certainly not looking to pursue any sort of gun control measures. They don't work, for one, and they cause a whole lot more problems than having guns be legal do. However, you know, with the Me Too campaign that we were talking about last week that was getting a lot of attention, what did I see all over my feed coming from a lot of people? These responses where they're posting up their guns with a hashtag not me, or they're just using the hashtag Me Too, and they're saying, I have this gun, this will never happen to me. I think there's a really powerful piece that was put out in the Daily Signal by someone named, I'm trying to think of her name now, I think it's Amy Shermer, maybe?
Swearer, I think?
Swearer, yeah, it might be Swearer, something like that. But I think it's a really good piece. I believe it's called I'm a Conservative and I Was Raped. Here's How I Feel About Me Too. She recently moved to DC. She had gone to a bar to meet her friends. She wasn't going to a bar alone because that's something that comes up a lot, but she'd gone to meet her friends. They text her last minute saying they can't get there. So she's just finishing her one drink. And then all of a sudden she blacks out. She doesn't know what's happening. She wakes up 12 hours later in a hospital. She's in pain all over. She doesn't know what's happened. She finds out that she was apparently covered in vomit, screaming for help in the metro station, and someone had drugged her and raped her. They did tests. She had no alcohol in her blood system because she consumed so little alcohol. It was very clear that someone had drugged her and had attacked her in this way. And she talks about how she'd always thought people who get raped, they're not taking the precautions, they're not doing these things. She was talking about how I had guns, and I've always said victims are in some part responsible for what happens to them. It's never going to happen to me. I have guns. I'm strong. I'm paying attention to my surroundings. It still happened. And I think that that's really important to look at. I also want to go back to something you sort of started the conversation with, and I'm glad that Anna Shea did a really good job of addressing this as well. One of the things that really bothered me when people, mainly women, but people in general, were sharing their stories with the Me Too campaign is that I was seeing all of these folks saying, oh, where's the police report? If there's no police report, clearly no abuse happened. And we sort of saw an echo of this with Weinstein, where people were coming out and saying, why would you say something now so many years later? You didn't report it to the police originally. Clearly it didn't happen. That shows a huge misunderstanding about the way that the legal system works in this country. And of course I believe in due process. I think it's incredibly important. I also think that the facts of the matter are true. Out of every 1,000 rape cases that go to trial, so this is cases where someone's already reported, which we know is a very small percentage of the rapes. Someone has reported this rape. They've investigated this rape. They had enough evidence to take it to trial. That's a huge step. of all of these cases, I think it's still 994. Yes, 994 of those 1,000 cases of the rapes that ever happened, 994 of those people end up going free. Is it possible that the only rapists are that small percentage? I mean, I guess technically it is possible, but it seems highly unlikely to me that of all the rapes we're only seeing, 6 out of every few thousand? So if about 25% of people report their rape, maybe about 10% of that go to trial and 0.4% of that gets convicted. I mean, that's not a good rate. And not only that, you're talking about a case that's going to take 2 years on average, and between 2 to 4 years from the time of reporting to the case being ended. That's thousands upon thousands of dollars in legal fees. That's if your rape kit even gets tested. That's assuming that you have that level of support that, for instance, Anna Shea said that she had from her mother, but a lot of rape survivors say that they did not get. They face problems like, for instance, their spouses divorcing them. They face their family calling them out for making trouble, for making their family's name look bad, because people don't want to be associated with this. I've had friends who've reported rapes that happened at work, and the culture at work, they told HR, and then all of a sudden they see that their schedule has been switched so that they spend all of their shifts exclusively with the person that they reported raping them. Why do they do this? So that they'll quit and they don't have to deal with it as a problem anymore. They don't have to worry about workers' comp. They don't have to do all these other things. And I think if you're looking at it in this environment where people don't want to go up on trial, have their entire life history dragged up, have questions like, do you think you drink too much? I don't know. It seems like you've dated more than one person before. Do you really think that you should be wearing outfits like that in public? I think I see some collarbone here. It looks very sexy. All of those kinds of things. And we're saying that if you're not able to go through that and get a conviction, which is completely unlikely to happen, then you never got assaulted. I understand where people are coming from when they say that people who don't speak out, they're just as bad as rapists because they're letting them perpetuate what's happening. But it's total bullshit. All you're saying is that the victims, the people who've been attacked, need to throw their lives on the line for a next to nil chance of ever getting any sort of conviction. That's going to take them about 5 years of their life, all their money, possibly their job, their relationships, all of that. And for what? I'm sorry, I just don't think that that's a good response.
Wow.
I have to agree with everything you've said. Everything you've said is extraordinarily important. And those numbers, people know those numbers. Like, even if they don't know the actual numbers, they know what their percentages are. They know how likely it is that their parents are going to be sitting there in a courtroom with them, and they're going to have a defense lawyer come up and just absolutely eviscerate them. Mm-hmm. Possibly talk about their parents who have done nothing wrong. And the likelihood of them actually getting any sort of real justice out of the entire process after thousands upon thousands of dollars is so slim to none. Also, to your point about guns and how if you have a gun, things are not going to happen to you. That's not necessarily the truth at all. You have two things working against you in that. One, most of the people who commit assault and rape against women are close family and friends. That's the majority of them, which adds a completely new complex level to reporting that kind of thing, because you're not looking at just reporting somebody who's done something terrible to you. It's not just a somebody out in the ether. It's somebody in your own social circle.
Almost always someone who's very close to you.
Which is going to break your friends apart, break your family apart, something like that. So you have all of that to deal with as well. You're standing to lose a lot and have very little actual payoff for it. And then you also have the whole, oh, I have a gun, nothing's going to happen to me. I carry 2 pistols, and I can tell you right now that while those pistols may help me in certain situations, if somebody really, really wanted to rape me and I got my pistol out to do something to them, it wouldn't exactly be that hard for them to take that gun from me and turn it around on me, which actually they have an incentive to do, because if they let me live through it, I can report them.
Absolutely.
So they actually would have an incentive to use that gun against me.
There's no reason that they're likely to hold back at that point anyway.
No.
Yeah.
And I also want to take a second to just call out, like, who are we expecting these people who have been raped to be reporting their rapes to? Is it the police department? Because then I think we need to ask some serious questions about the rate of sexual assault happening within our police departments and our criminal justice system. Just this week, there's been this huge case of police in Brooklyn gang raping a girl, and their response was, oh, well, she consented. Just look at the photos of her on her Instagram. She's got all these sexy photos on there. So clearly, it was totally fine for us to gang rape her. Sex workers a lot of times are targeted by police who rape them and then arrest them for it. This is not just NYPD. NYPD does have a pervasive problem with this, but it's all across the country, certainly all across the world. Thin blue line is a real problem. And if you really think that someone going in to the police department and saying, hey, you know, your coworkers, your buddies, the ones you hang out with every night, they raped me. Can you investigate that? How well do you think that that's going to go?
Right. We heard about the case of Daniel Holtzclaw, the police officer. I forget what part of the country, who was, in his case, fortunately convicted.
Yeah, after he raped over almost 100 women, many of them on a weekly basis for years.
That's right. Targeting them because many of them were prostitutes, poor, minorities, and relatively powerless people, less likely to be believed. As they say, there are levels to this. There are a lot of different dynamics and nuances of the issue that a lot of these folks running their mouths online and elsewhere just don't know, can't be bothered to research, or willfully ignore. You have to take all those things into account. When it comes to the whole question of advising girls and women on how to protect themselves, I do think it's critical to recognize that there is no foolproof tool. That shouldn't surprise us, because that's the case with crime in general. A few years ago, I was assaulted on the Washington, D.C. subway. I had gone out partying at a friend's 21st birthday party the night before. I had a light dinner too early, drank too much wild turkey while I was pre-gaming and bar hopping that night. Fell asleep on the subway ride home. A couple of young punks, I guess they must have wanted to find out what it would be like, what it would take to wake this drunk fool up on the subway train. Slapped me in the face a couple times. I didn't wake up. One of them hit me in the side of the face with his fist half closed and a ring on his finger. Dented a bone in my face. My zygomatic arch is a bone that goes over your jaw. Dented it inward. I woke up screaming in pain like a baby. Not even ashamed to admit it. It was that excruciating. I spent 8 days in the hospital, underwent surgery for the first time in my life, got hit with a $400,000 hospital bill. Now, because I got Medicaid coverage in the end, I didn't have to pay a dime, but that's just an idea of the kind of thing that can happen. Now, I remember while I was in my hospital room, I got a call from a relative of mine who proceeded to give me a lecture about the importance of avoiding bad neighborhoods. And I had to remind him, oh, this didn't happen in a bad neighborhood. In fact, it didn't happen in any neighborhood at all. It happened on a subway train in a tunnel between stations, and both of those stations were in downtown Washington, D.C. And what's more, this was after I had spent 3 years living in East Harlem. So, you know, I developed some street smarts by this point. So one way or the other, I really didn't need that lecture. Like I mentioned to you guys in our last conversation, when I was about to go off to college, one of my uncles and a few of my aunts and my mother, they gave me some advice on how to protect myself, etc. I wasn't mad at them for offering the advice, but some of the advice made sense, some of it didn't. And I do think we need to be very discriminating in how we respond to all of that counsel. Charles, in your case, one thing that you had mentioned since our last conversation was that we need to come up with a way of, on the one hand, giving the support that we need to give to sexual assault survivors, particularly on a case-by-case basis. But at the same time, like I think Kat had mentioned earlier, due process is very critical, and whether it's on campus or in the justice system, that's something that needs to be respected as well. Did you have any thoughts as to how to strike that balance? I'm not asking for definitive answers here, because who even knows if those exist, let alone whether any of us can come up with them. But any thoughts you might have on that subject would be greatly welcome.
Well, I think that is a very tough issue, but it's also a very important issue, and it's one that I think that all of us are going to have to continue to wrestle with, especially as more of these types of accusations come forward. I'll admit that I'm kind of working through this myself, so what you hear shouldn't be taken as kind of a definitive answer from me, and my views on what the proper way of striking that balance is certainly subject to change. But I think that one thing is that we have to create the type of judicial system in which people are encouraged to come forward with accusations when they've been raped or otherwise sexually abused. We need to create a system that encourages and makes it possible for people to come forward as quickly as possible. Because I would say that the quicker somebody comes forward, the easier it's probably going to be to assess whether or not the defendant is guilty or not. One of the things that we're going to need to do, honestly, is that we are going to need to address a lot of the issues that you guys have talked about as far as aspects of sort of our culture and our system that do discourage women from coming forward and that do prevent their accusations from being taken seriously. I'm not an expert on real life special victims units. But the issue of rape by police officers, if that's rampant in police departments, then it may become necessary to essentially establish a separate police agency to deal with sex crimes. I don't know, I'm just sort of throwing that out there. Another thing that is probably going to be necessary is to sort of have somebody, whether it's a university or in the police department or whatever, kind of have somebody who interacts with the accuser. And that person doesn't question the accuser's account at all, doesn't treat it as though they might be fudging it. And then you have other people who are responsible for investigating the accusations and trying to get to the bottom of whether or not they're correct. I think that in our culture, what we honestly have to do, and this is difficult given how many cases like this crop up, especially now, but I think in our culture, what we have to do when we hear that somebody has been accused of sexual misconduct is that we do have to research the case as much as possible and really try to figure out what the evidence is on both sides. As good as social media has been for a lot of this, especially with things like the Me Too campaign, I do worry that social media, obviously in the Harvey Weinstein case, there's no debating that the guy is guilty. We know that Harvey Weinstein did what he's being accused of, possibly more. But in general, I do worry that the social media encourages people, as soon as an accusation is made, to make snap judgments on one side or the other. Because it's not just, I've seen people make snap judgments on the side of the defendants also, but I'm concerned that social media is encouraging people to make these snap judgments. And then once somebody has publicly said that a person is innocent or that they're guilty, nobody really wants to have to go back and rescind what they've said and apologize to either the accuser or the defendant when there's an accusation that's made. If we want to comment on it, and we probably should be commenting on this a lot, because it is an extremely important issue. But I think that before we comment on specific accusations, we do need to assess all the evidence. I think that all those are important ways of sort of balancing those two essential needs: the need for due process and the need to protect innocent people from being convicted or otherwise punished, and also the need to make sure that sexual abuse victims get all the support that they need and that people who commit these acts are punished to the full extent of the law.
Thank you so much, Charles, for mentioning that, because I think that proposal you just made is a very good one. It is important to have someone involved in the investigation of these cases who will, at the very least, strike a believing posture in dealing with the person who's reporting the sexual assault, because the statistical likelihood is that she's telling the truth. And although, yes, the system, those investigating it, need to look at the evidence with as open a mind as possible, they'll have someone who, in all likelihood, is telling the truth, has suffered a grievous crime, and needs support, and needs to be believed by someone. Having someone whose entire job is to provide that kind of counseling service, I think that's a very good idea. I understand some college campuses have already taken that step, and we could use more of that in law enforcement as well. It's really too bad that not every police officer out there could be like Detective Olivia Benson on Law and Order SVU, because she does a great job of that on that show.
I wanted to address a couple of things. I think that the advocacy that you guys are talking about for people who have experienced these things is a very real necessity that we need to be making actual room for. And I think there is a possibility for, and this is going to sound a little crazy, but I actually think that there is a possibility for the market to step up and actually create that kind of space that's needed through creating a third-party agency to do rape kit testing. There's lots of different businesses already doing phlebotomy and doing those kinds of cultures on par with what you do with a rape kit. And I think that it would be a really great idea to take that away from the state, especially since it's so backlogged. Start a third party through the market where you actually have those kinds of things. And then as far as the advocacy goes, that's another opportunity for nonprofits to step up and actually do those kinds of things and actually fulfill those roles that women are not getting. There are a lot of advocacy groups, but they don't get a lot of funding. They fly under the radar, and a lot of people don't really know anything about them. And I think that this is an opportunity for the market to actually start working in people's favor in that way, because the government on just about every level is clearly failing us. And I think that that's something that we should address.